Okay, so good afternoon. Today we're going to recap part 2 of the course, which has covered the main actors involved in EU foreign policy. Just to put you in context, part 2 comes after having examined the historical development of European foreign and security policy cooperation, and after having surveyed the main theoretical approaches to European foreign policy. So the second part of the course, which is the actors in European foreign policy, has spanned over 5 sessions. In the first one, I provided you with a general overview of the main roles and actors involved in EU foreign policy, and that served sort of as an introductory to the 4 subsequent sessions, which covered the European Council, the Commission, the Parliament, and the big 3, meaning Britain, France, and Germany. Now, Dr. Tănăsescu, who covered the European Commission, will not be able to join us. You should be able to find the slides of her lecture in Poincaré, though, and Dr. Sapala, who gave the lecture on the European Parliament, won't be able to join either, but Dr. Biedenkopf will fill in for her. So before Professor Alexander Matelar, Dr. Biedenkopf, and Mr. Daniel Pio tell you about the roles of the Council, the Parliament, and the big 3, let us very quickly brush up on the main principles, aims, and rules underpinning EU foreign policy. Starting with the principles. The Lisbon Treaty states very explicitly the main principles and aims underpinning the EU's external action. In particular, it's important to bear in mind that the EU claims to pursue abroad the same aims that informed its genesis. So according to the treaty, and now I'm quoting from the treaty, principles which have inspired its own creation, development, and enlargement, and which it seeks to advance in the wider world. Democracy, the rule of law, the universality and divisibility of human rights and fundamental freedoms, respect for human dignity, the principles of equality and solidarity, and respect for the principles of the UN and the Charter of International Law. In particular, the EU Treaty says that the EU, in its external action, shall promote multilateral solutions to common problems, in particular in the framework of the United Nations. And this is very important to bear in mind because the UN is prominent in the EU's external narrative. So very quickly, then let's move on now to the aims, which the aims of EU foreign policy, which emanate directly from the principles, but are more specific in nature. The aims are also contained in the aims of EU foreign policy are also contained in the Lisbon Treaty, and they are the following: to safeguard its values, fundamental interests, security, independence, and integrity; to consolidate and support democracy, the rule of law, human rights, and the principles of international law; to preserve peace, prevent conflicts, and strengthen international security; to foster a sustainable economic, social, and environmental development of developing countries with a primary aim of eradicating poverty; and to promote an international system based on stronger multilateral cooperation and good global governance. It's important to bear in mind that the principles underpinning EU foreign policy or EU external relations and the aims sort of set the framework for where all of the EU's external actions take place. Now let's not forget that not every policy field in the area of external relations, of EU external relations, is governed by the same procedures and rules. And in fact, as I mentioned in the lecture a few months ago now, some scholars have referred to the European Union external relations as an institutional framework that is single by name, dual by regime, and multiple by nature. And that sort of quote, that famous quote, sort of conceptualizes the plurality of rules that govern the EU external relations. Generally speaking, the community method, meaning the supranational method that characterizes the European community, applies to trade, to development cooperation, aid, and to the external dimension of the EU's internal policies. And in contrast, intergovernmental cooperation, so the so-called Pillar 2, applies to CFSP, to CSDP, and also to the external aspects of justice and home affairs. So that's in general, but other than those general governing rules in terms of external relations, there are a few other important points that we should that it's important that we remember regarding the decision-making procedure. The first one is that the initiative is shared, and in EU external relations, broadly speaking, now is shared depending on the issue at hand, is shared between the member states, the Commission, and the High Representative for CFSP. A second point that it's important to bear in mind is that decisions are generally made by unanimity, except where the treaty provides otherwise. And I think the figure of constructive abstention, which we discussed in the lecture, is an example of this, of one of these exceptions. And a third important point that is important that you bear in mind is that decisions by QMV, decisions can be taken by qualified majority voting to implement decisions that have already been approved by the European Council, or to define an agreed action or position, to specify a position that has already been approved by the European Council by unanimity. A couple of other things that we should also keep in mind is that the European Commission, is fully associated with the common foreign and security policy, and that means that it's usually represented in all of CFSP's meetings, and also has the right of initiative. However, that right is not exclusive, as it is in the realm of foreign economic policy. And finally, just to remind you that the European Parliament and the European Court of Justice continue to have very limited powers in the area of common foreign and security policy. Now, in terms of representation, the treaty stipulates that the High Representative for CFSP shall be the one that represents the union in general. So according to Article 13, and I'm quoting, the High Representative shall represent the Union for matters relating to the common foreign and security policy. However, I mean, having said that, the scope for the High Representative to represent the European Union on a given issue depends usually upon a Council mandate and also upon the availability of instruments to support the High Representative's diplomatic activities. It's important to remember that the High Representative's role is restricted to the common foreign and security policy. Remember that we were talking always about this distinction between the common foreign and security policy and external relations. That was a broader concept. So the High Representative does not have a monopoly of the external representation of the EU. There are other individuals that can represent the EU depending on the issue at hand, including the President of the European Council, Van Rompuy, the President of the Commission, different commissioners, and also the states who hold the rotating presidency of the Council of the EU, as I explained in the lecture. Now, one of the main points of the main aims of the Lisbon Treaty was precisely to ensure greater consistency in the Union's external actions. And now I'm quoting again from the treaty. According to Article 10A of the treaty, the Union shall ensure consistency between the different areas of its external action and between these and its other policies. The Council and the Commission, assisted by the High Representative of the Union for Foreign Affairs and Security Policy, shall ensure that consistency and shall cooperate to that effect. So, with the aim of strengthening consistency in the area of external relations in general, so with that aim in mind, the positions of High Representative and External Relations Commissioner were merged by the Lisbon Treaty, and in addition to this, the European External Action Service was also created. So it's important to know that one of the main objectives of the Lisbon Treaty is to actually strengthen the consistency of the EU's external relations, and some of the flagship movements in this regard are the merger of the position of the High Representative with that of External Relations Commissioner, the creation of the EAS, European External Action Service, but also the granting of international legal personality to the European Union as a whole. International legal personality before Lisbon was reserved to the European Commission and to the European Commission alone. Okay, so those are sort of the highlights that I wanted to bring up in the limited time frame that we have. So now that we've defined the main principles and aims underpinning European foreign policy, and that I've outlined some of the main decision-making procedures of CFSP, it's time to go through the main actors engaging in EU foreign policy making. So I leave the floor now to Professor Alexander Matelaert, who will start with the European Council. Thank you.
All right, a very good afternoon, everyone. It's a pleasure to address you today on the topic of the European Council and the intergovernmental way of operating in the broader process of European integration, and we'll pay some specific attention, of course, to the foreign policy area. What I will do today is to essentially give you the very brief wrap up of the earlier lecture that I gave in class, and then we'll also devote some specific attention to the European Council later this week, starting tomorrow afternoon, in fact, so that you get an update of what's going on and how all these discussions that take place whenever the Council gets together, they really do have a very profound effect on the broader debate on what's going on in Europe and the overarching direction into which the European Union writ large is marching into. So, as we already learned, the European Council is effectively composed of this bunch of people. You see here the family picture of the European Council meeting in October. So we are effectively talking about the group composed of all European heads of state or government, assisted by the permanent presidents. That is, the permanent president of the European Council, Herman Van Rompuy, and the president of the European Commission, José Manuel Barroso. And whenever there is a specific need, it can also involve the president of the European Parliament, currently Martin Schulz, or the High Representative for the CFSP, Lady Catherine Ashton, and occasionally it can even be expanded beyond, as we will shortly discuss. The European Council is effectively the get-together for the supreme political authorities in the entire European political system. What the European Council is responsible for essentially boils down to two areas. They're responsible for treaty change, and they are responsible for providing what is called strategic direction to the entire European Union setup. They typically get together for at least 4 times a year, but as we have seen in recent years, when there have been an endless series of mostly finance-related crises on the agenda, this can be adapted to a much more frequent meeting rhythm. So on average, we're really talking about 6-7 times a year over the past couple of years. If we briefly, so we've covered that. If we briefly zoom in on how the foreign policy system of the European Union works, well, you essentially have a sort of waterfall system of political authority in which the European Council defines the overarching principles and the general orientation of the Union's foreign policy and security and defense policies, which is typically done through the adoption of common strategies. The most well-known example in that regard is the European security strategy that got first adopted in 2003 and slightly updated in 2008. There is now a very lively debate going on whether or not the European security strategy should be reviewed once more, and perhaps reviewed in a much more fundamental way, given that the world picture is in flux, so to speak, with a lot of turmoil in the European southern neighborhood, discussions on the future of the European eastern neighborhood, the Americans pivoting away from Europe to the Asia Pacific, and the rise of the so-called emerging powers. So there is really some difficult to identify, but this big political force building up for reviewing the overarching strategy in the light of a changing world. So that strategic level, that is really where the European Council, so the heads of state and government, really exercise their influence. They decide on the very, very big questions of principle and political orientation of the Union. The Foreign Affairs Council, at a lower level, the foreign affairs ministers getting together roughly on a monthly basis, then these guys are responsible, men and women, I should say, are of course responsible for taking the implementing decisions for driving this policy forward. For security and defense policies, that means setting up new missions under the missions and operations under the flag of the European Union. They can discuss the issuing financial sanctions, and they can essentially give broader guidance to the other foreign policy tools that the European Union has at its disposal. This waterfall system then continues. The ministers delegate powers to the ambassadors. The ambassadors delegate powers to various working groups. European institutions start plugging in on all these working levels. But it's good to keep in mind that this is really a waterfall system of political authority and hierarchy, so to speak, with the European Council on top, the Council of Ministers below, the ambassadors and the European institutions below that. The principal way of operating in the CFSP is the intergovernmental method. That is to say, all the member states, be it at the level of the Council or of the European Council, need to put their signature on whatever decision that gets adopted. There are only a few narrowly defined exceptions to this intergovernmental system. So instances where decisions can be taken by qualified majority voting. And we are really talking about decisions that are about implementing a decision that has been taken on the higher level by unanimity, or when it comes to assigning special representatives. You know, whenever jobs need to be filled with specific individuals, that can be very difficult to agree upon at the level of the 28. So their qualified majority voting is essentially a mechanism to press for consensus and to make sure that if there is really no consensus, then at least something can be done to keep the ship afloat, so to speak. The intergovernmental process itself, that is really a bargaining process. It's about diplomatic horse trading as it has been practiced throughout centuries. One must keep in mind that an intergovernmental system, whether it is practiced in the European Union or in any other international organization, fundamentally follows the logic of taking decisions by the lowest common denominator. That's sort of self-evident. If all member states have to sign up to the decision that is proposed, well, it is the most reluctant member state that effectively limits the precise content of the decision that gets eventually adopted. Of course, to block or to constrain the content of a specific policy proposal, it comes at a diplomatic price. Big member states can get away with much more. Small member states need to watch out with casting their veto. But eventually, there is always the risk that blocking a proposal too often risks leading to threats of exclusion. And we have seen this most recently when the proposal was to essentially have the no deficit clause injected to the constitutions of all member states. The British did not want to sign up to it. Well, what eventually happened, 25 of the then 27 member states effectively bypassed the United Kingdom and the Czech Republic to essentially adopt that proposal simply through an intergovernmental treaty outside the EU framework, but to be implemented and overseen through the European institutions nonetheless. In this bargaining process amongst national capitals, what is also a very typical feature is that different policy dossiers get linked up with one another, even if they have, in terms of actual content, nothing to do with one another whatsoever. So that means, well, Member State X wants the support of Member State Y on policy dossier A and says, well, if you support me on dossier A, I'll support you on dossier B. So we can effectively do a trade in which one member state or group of member states presses for a specific position in return for favors on other dossiers, and that means that the eventual decisions that get taken typically consist of package deals in which various policy areas get connected with one another. If we really want to study this from a scholarly perspective, then the way to do so is really to follow what I call the paper trail. This bargaining process is really about following the ideas that get proposed, and in bureaucratic terms, they get proposed through issuing food for thought papers, non-papers, discussion papers. The label of the type of paper may change, but the ideas are being circulated in a written format. And the discussion always starts with vague ideas in short papers, and these then eventually get distilled into actual minutes of meetings of the European Council or of the Council of Ministers. And it is through following that paper trail that you can actually see and analyze the evolution of a specific discussion taking place at the political level. As I already hinted at earlier, in this horse trading process, where member states support one another on specific dossiers, one must of course keep in mind that the member states do not always vote together, and the sort of intra-European alliance system is a flexible one. To put it very bluntly, sometimes the French side with the British, sometimes the French side with the Germans. It really depends on the type of question that is at hand, and that is the same for each and every individual member state. Now, arguably the most important job of the European Council is to oversee the process of treaty change. Now, it is, of course, the European Commission that is the guardian of the treaties as they exist, as they are codified into legal text. But whenever the laws need to be changed and the constitutional arrangement of European integration needs to be revisited, that is the prerogative of the European heads of state and government. There is also a specific link to discussion of foreign policy in this regard, in the sense that from a member state's perspective, the question how the European Union itself works effectively boils down to a foreign policy question, arguably the most fundamental and important foreign policy question that most European Union member states actually face. And it is for that very reason that there is a very cumbersome process to actually go about this, so that there is ample time to really study what goes on. This is actually called the Intergovernmental Conference procedure, where all member states assemble big delegations to start working on an update of the treaties. This is, given the actual size of the treaties, you can already imagine that you need quite a bit of lawyers, quite a bit of specialists for this. And the interesting thing is that every time that the treaties get revisited, you get the same old dilemmas and themes popping up again. Because effectively, what the treaties also are all about, they stipulate how the European Union as an international organization should work. But that also means that the treaties effectively cast the verdict on how political power is distributed between the member states on the one hand and the European institutions on the other. But even more sensitive is the fact that the treaties then to some extent also reflect a calibration of political power amongst member states. Remember when the Treaty of Lisbon was updating the qualified majority voting system codified in the Treaty of Nice, it effectively was about scrapping the different weight factors of the votes of individual member states and replacing this by demographically based factors. That, of course, entailed a relatively significant recalibration of how the voting weight of an individual member state gets calculated, and also a system that sets the course for future evolutions, because it really means if your demographic size is shrinking, you will grow weaker, politically speaking, and if your demographic size is increasing, you will grow stronger, politically speaking, over the very, very long term. Now, this was a cartoon that was originally published in the Observer Sunday paper in 2011, when there is when there was effectively a big fight going on over how to redesign the Eurozone when it was at the very verge of collapse. And I put it up here to some extent draw a bit of a contrast between where we are today. Because if you will allow me to give you the sort of preview of what will be discussed later this week, so we have the European Council coming up on Thursday, running into Friday. Well, what is on the agenda? On Thursday afternoon, there will be a thematic discussion on the state of defense in Europe. For that very purpose, the NATO Secretary General is also going to plug in, so that already gives a hint that it's not just about CSDP, but it's about defense in Europe, also about the transatlantic relationship, also about defense capabilities writ large. Specifically, on on that debate, we see that there is quite a fundamental disagreement amongst the big member states, in the sense that the British are effectively saying no to Europe on defense. The Germans are saying no to actual military deployments or common funding for defense. And the French, that used to be the sort of locomotive or the driving force behind European defense cooperation, have to some extent given up as a result of the frustration of not getting other member states to jump on board of the train. But we see there that as a result of the lack of consensus on operational matters, the debate effectively turned towards industrial cooperation. But now the British government is very vocal in making its voice heard, so that the plans of the European Commission would not encroach on the national control over defense industries. But it is actually only in the evening that the very politically salient points will get on the agenda, because it's the dinner and then the after dinner discussion that will be devoted to the completion of the European Monetary Union and the setting up of a banking union. If you have seen the breaking news on the Financial Times this morning, it seems that there is an agreement, a tentative deal that everybody is ready to sign up to, with the caveat that the common backstop will only get implemented as of 2025, so 12 years down the road, really. That really reflects a pretty important change of political balance from where we were in 2011 to now the end of 2013, in the sense that where at the end of 2011, Sarkozy, who was at the very end of his presidency, did not have major leverage anymore, and David Cameron, by essentially not being willing to negotiate, effectively put himself in such a position of isolation that he could be de facto ignored, and the whole golden rule idea got set up through an intergovernmental agreement outside of the EU context. Now, that is subtly changing, in the sense that the French president Hollande, even if he's not very popular in his own country, is effectively rallying support from a whole bunch of member states against the continuation of budgetary austerity. There will also be a review of the whole compact of growth, jobs, competition, etc., on the agenda late on Thursday evening and Friday morning. And even the United Kingdom is also finding a number of allies for the dossiers that are close to its heart. In particular, Denmark is also looking for renegotiating the direction into which the European Commission wants to march into, as far as the defense industry is concerned. I think I've spoken for far too long, so I'll wrap up here and hand over to my colleagues. Thank you.
Good, thank you. I'm taking you away from the intergovernmental bargaining, which might be the most exciting about EU foreign and security policy, to an institution that started off as a very humble institution, but it has been around from the beginning, from the European Coal and Steel Community and the Rome Treaties. We've already had the European Parliament, but it was not called that way in the very beginning. And that's actually one of the main messages that that we can learn from the history and the evolution of the European Parliament, that it's really step by step in the course of its history, it has gained more power, it has become an equal partner to the European Council, to the Council of Ministers in many policy areas, but not in the common foreign and security policy yet. But we'll get to that and to the European Parliament's role in the common foreign and security policy in the end of this presentation. But first of all, I'm quickly going to go through the historical development so that we understand where the Parliament comes from. I'll describe some of the roles or the main roles of the European Parliament and the way it's organized internally. So if you look at the historical development of the Parliament, as I said already, it's as old as the EU itself. We already had a common assembly in the European Coal and Steel Community, but it was a very different kind of entity. First of all, the members had a dual mandate, so they were not only members of the Common Assembly, but they were members of the national parliaments and then sent to the Common Assembly to represent their member states or their interests. So they were both European and national assembly members. And also this Common Assembly did not have any legislative power yet. And if you look at the news in environmental policy and many other policy areas today, it certainly has legislative power now. So a lot of things changed. Maybe the first thing changed is the Rome Treaties, where this assembly was now called European Parliamentary Assembly. So already the name changed. And the Parliament very early on, so from 59 onwards, got some limited budgetary powers. And it made good use of these budgetary powers. And we can sometimes read about that as the power of the purse. So what the Parliament did is it actually made very good use of these limited budgetary powers to get from the Commission and from the Council what it wanted. So it sort of used its power that the Council needed the Parliament's agreement to some decisions and engaged in similar horse tradings that Alexandra just referred to within the Council. So said, if you give us that, if you do these kind of things, then we will agree to the budgetary, or we give you our consent to these budgetary requirements or whatever the Parliament, whatever powers the Parliament had at the time. And what you can see as well is there were many informal deals, which then were also enshrined in later treaties. But for example, in the 70s, the Parliament got some more powers in what was called the non-compulsory expenditure, which basically excluded the common agricultural policy. But then in the 70s, the Parliament got more powers, and it could even propose some modifications for the compulsory expenditures, which basically was the common agricultural policy. But yeah, let's not go too much into detail, but it's a very important point to understand the Parliament's evolution. And what the Parliament also did very early on, in '62, it called itself European Parliament. That was not written in the treaties yet, but there was already this understanding of the parliamentarians themselves that they do play a big role and that they should be seen as a parliament, namely the European Parliament. What has changed as well is the way the Parliament is elected. In the beginning, as I said, members had a dual mandate. They were primarily national members of Parliament, and then they were delegated to also serve on this European Assembly. And but then already in the 60s, the Parliament asked for itself or made a proposal to have European elections through a universal direct suffrage. So the Parliament already made this proposal in the 60s, but the Council actually only adopted this proposal in the 70s. So that only in '79 we have the first election of the European Parliament through direct universal suffrage. And since then we've had European parliamentary elections every 5 years. well, I say direct universal suffrage, but it doesn't mean that the elections are entirely the same in every country. There are some differences, and I think you talked about that more in class. So you have proportionate representation in every country, but it is a bit different. And some countries have a single constituency, some others have regional constituencies. The different ages as to from what age you can vote and from what age you can be elected differ a bit. So you have some differences, but there are also commonalities. And also the range of days when the parliamentary election takes place is the same. And we'll have elections coming up next year. So that's why it's also a very important point to look at. Another thing that has changed a lot in the past few decades with regard to Parliament is just its powers in terms of legislative, of lawmaking. So with the Single European Act, the cooperation procedure was introduced. So that was for the first time that the Parliament actually had, in certain areas, some powers. It was still the Council that had the final say, and the Parliament was far from being an equal legislative power, but nonetheless slowly did it gain more powers. And then with the Treaty of Maastricht, the co-decision procedure was introduced and the cooperation procedure was extended. And then with different treaty revisions, so Amsterdam, again, the co-decision was extended and simplified. So now you could also have an agreement after the first or second reading, or first reading, so you didn't need to go through all the readings, for example. And as we all know, now we don't call it co-decision anymore. So with the Lisbon Treaty, we have what we call the ordinary legislative procedure, which is applied to a large range of policy areas, but not common foreign and security policy, and I'll get to that in a second. So when you look at this historical development, the Parliament really step by step, with every treaty revision, has gained some more powers, has used very strategically the little powers it had in the beginning, and asked for more, did little horse tradings with the Council and the different governments who then negotiated the new treaties to actually get more power. And that's where we are today. And if you look at the roles of the European Parliament, basically you can split them into three main categories. And one is that we talked about already, it's lawmaking, it's legislative roles. But then also budgetary, and that's what I alluded to already in this historical overview. It's powers that the Parliament already had in the beginning, and they were increased in the course of its history. But then there's also a very important role, which is the supervision of the executive. If you go through these roles individually, the legislative roles, it's basically two main points. One is the Parliament can adopt initiative reports. And that's also something that has grown in the history. There was an informal agreement already between the Parliament and the Council and the Commission that it could ask for laws to be considered, so make proposals, ask the Commission to consider to make a legislative proposal, but now it's actually written in the Treaty on the Functioning of the European Union, namely Article 225. And so the Parliament can adopt by a majority of its composing members a request to the Commission to submit appropriate proposals. Basically what it means, the Parliament can ask the Commission to submit a proposal, but the Commission has very large discretion to fill in this proposal. So the content of the proposal could actually be very different from what the Parliament has asked. And then, of course, what we talked about already, the Parliament is an equal legislative power to the Council in many policy areas, in what used to be the first pillar policy areas, like environment, internal market, consumer protection. We actually have the ordinary legislative procedure, so Council and European Parliament are on par. Then we also have consultation and consent procedures in some other areas. For example, for international treaties, we need the consent of the European Parliament to ratify the treaties that were negotiated by the European Commission. If you look at the budgetary role, that's basically now, since the Lisbon Treaty, There's no distinction anymore between the compulsory and non-compulsory expenditures, so also in the Common Agricultural Policy, the Parliament has equal powers, and basically it comes down to the European Parliament's involvement and consent to the multi-annual financial frameworks, something that we talked about a lot in the past year, and also the annual budgets. The third big role that the Parliament plays is supervision of the executive, and that's also where common foreign and security policy comes in a bit more. Basically, what the Parliament does, or what you have now in the treaty, first of all, is that it is stated that the Commission President or the candidate for the presidency of the Commission should take the outcome of the European parliamentary elections into account. And that's what you see now. The Liberals are just talking about who their candidate for Commission President should be. The Socialists have already decided that Martin Schulz should be their candidate. So actually we have a bit more of a politicization also of these European parliamentary elections. But we also have Merkel, who already said that there's no, I don't know how she worded it, but basically saying it's taking into account, but it doesn't guarantee anything. What the Parliament does and can do or has to do is give a consent to the College of Commissioners. And basically what that comes down to is that every candidate for a commissioner's position has to go through a grilling procedure, through hearings in the European Parliament, which can be very tough, which in the past have led to countries proposing different candidates from their first proposal, because the Parliament indicated that they would not give their consent to the College of Commissioners if that particular candidate was actually part of it. And then, of course, linked to that, the Parliament can dismiss the College of Commissioners. The barrier, the threshold, is very high, so they would need 2/3 of the votes cast plus a majority of the members composing the Parliament. But nonetheless, they can dismiss the College of Commissioners. It almost happened, for example, in the case of Edith Cresson, a commissioner who hired her dentist, I believe. And yeah, so there was a threat, but then the president of the commission actually acted first, so it didn't happen entirely. What the Parliament does as well is scrutinizing the budget and the policies of the Commission. So it discusses the annual general report of the Commission. It scrutinizes the Commission accounts. It monitors policy implementation. It can also establish temporary committees of inquiry, and it can ask questions to the Commission. So a whole host of different means, tools that the Parliament can use to politicize, to publicize certain issues, and to put pressure on the Commission. You might wonder why there's not much council in there. But basically, this is based on the fundamental idea that council members are, of course, accountable to their national parliaments. So we'd have the European Parliament holding the Commission accountable, and national parliaments holding their respective national government accountable. If we then move to the organization, so how does the Parliament do all of these tasks, and how is it organized internally? Just very basic, we currently have 766 MEPs, which is kind of weird because the treaty says we can only have 750 plus the president. And we will have 750 or 751 MEPs after the next parliamentary elections. These 766 just come from the fact that the current MEPs were still elected under the previous Nice Treaty, which had actually a limit of 736, and then there was an agreement that the member states who would get more MEPs could get under Lisbon could get them now already, and the other ones wouldn't lose any. And then we had Croatia joining, so the number just went up, but it's going to get down again. I just put here the list of the MEPs under the Lisbon Treaty, but I have to say Croatia isn't in that list yet, so the numbers are slightly different, but it can give you an idea. The Parliament internally is organized in committees, and I just put the list of the standing committees here. So it does have different committees with to which members are assigned to in a different, well, political and difficult procedure. And so these MEPs first discuss the different policy areas in their respective committee, and then it goes to the plenary. Oops, my slide for the political groups looks a bit weird. So, but actually, they're also MEPs are organized in political groups, or most of them are part of a political group. There are 7 at the moment. The biggest are the European People's Party and the Socialists and Democrats, but we also have Liberals, Greens, Eurosceptics, yeah, a number of different political ideologies, as you would have in national parliaments as well. So if we quickly move back to common foreign and security policy, the area that we're actually meant to talk about, the parliament isn't the main player there, isn't yet. So maybe step by step it will enter that field as well. But what we see is the parliament is mentioned in Article 36 of the Treaty on European Union. And I put that article here, and so to make it very easy, I highlighted and underlined the important tasks that the parliament can actually do. And if you look at that, we don't even need to read the whole text. It already gives you the big picture. So the parliament, it's regularly consulted, it's informed, it's duly taken into consideration. It can make recommendations, address questions. So you already see there's no binding involvement there. Of course, what we do have is, as I said earlier, with the scrutiny of the Commission as well, the Parliament can actually raise issues, can make them publicly heard, can make a big, let's say, public campaign around them, so that actually it will get politically very difficult for certain politicians to totally disregard what the Parliament said. So you don't have the formal involvement in the sense that the Parliament must give its consent, but you have a lot of the more softer powers that the Parliament can exert. Good, so that is Article 36 on the Treaty on the European Union. And basically, we've already seen that the Parliament really mainly is an advisory, monitoring, and scrutinizing role. And then there's just one additional role that I wanted to mention, and that's the budget again. You know, it already was there in the beginning of the Parliamentary Assembly, and it's here too. So for small parts of the expenditure, so basically administrative and operational expenditures that are part of the EU budget, the Parliament obviously is involved through the normal procedures, as it would be in any other budgetary issues. And if you look at the Parliament, foreign policy does play a big role, actually. You have a direct structure. You have a Foreign Affairs Committee, which is very prestigious. It has big names and big politicians who are part and who really want to be part of this committee. And you also have delegations. You have EU, the parliamentary delegation to the US, to many either countries or also ASEAN, for example, so regional integration organizations. And you also have some indirectly linked committees, Development Committee, International Trade Committee. So foreign and security policy does play a big role in the discussion, and the Parliament really wants to be involved.
Okay, good afternoon, everyone. I hope you can hear me loud and clear. And I hope, yes, you can see my face, despite the fact that there's an immense amount of light coming your way. Indeed, it is my job in the next 15 to 20 minutes to talk to you a little bit about the so-called Big Three within European Union foreign policy. And the Big Three, of course, refer to France, Germany, and the United Kingdom. And in many ways, my lecture will follow on from some of the important themes which Professor Mattala has already touched upon in his opening lecture. To talk about the Big Three in itself is actually quite a controversial topic within the realm of European Union foreign policy making, of course. The English words which we use, Big Three, in themselves don't necessarily refer to any form of leadership. They do in themselves refer to power, i.e. the three states in question having more power than the other member states in the Council. The French term that we use, the directoire, is much more controversial because it does indeed imply some form of leadership. overall, it's quite important to try and bear that in mind, and I'll come later with two more slides which will kind of explain this in a theoretical sense, this type of controversy. But first of all, how would we even try to calculate who these big three are? Well, one of the easy ways of doing it, of course, is to start looking at some of the important factors that make up power, I suppose, in international politics, but also within the European Union. And you can see on screen some of the important factors which I've put up there. Military, these three states, of course, spend more than the others in terms of defense spending. Diplomacy as well. Germany, France, and the UK tend to have many more diplomatic missions around the world than the other member states as well. In economic terms as well, from the World Bank, if you start looking at the top 10 economies in the world, you can see that all three of them rank with Germany in the leading position within the leading economies. Then, of course, there's the population size, and then we have factors such as history. Let's try and look at that in a bit more depth. Some of these are hard measurable facts. One can always look at what a country spends in terms of the GDP on defense. One can always look at the ranking in terms of the GDP output of an economy in a global sense from the economy. But then we have some immeasurables as well, which are quite difficult to pinpoint and to pin down. When one talks, for example, of a country having much more prestige than any other country, what does one really mean exactly? Does language play a role in this? Does the history play a role in this? When one thinks about the traditional definition of great powers, for example, of having won wars, which of course is the case with some of the member states in question here, does that confer in the modern period any form of power on these, on any of the big three? And that's an open question, and one that should be borne in mind as well. Of course, this has a theoretical or conceptual basis, because if one is talking about the big three, if one is singling out three states among all of the 28 member states, then one can say that you're leaning towards a much more realist worldview. That is, that power, even within the European Union, still makes a difference. And these three countries, Germany, France, and the UK, have much more power, in inverted commas, than many of the other member states. And of course, that this, in theory, gives them much more say within the formation of European Union foreign policy. But on the other hand, of course, we have the issue of a non-realist worldview, or a much more constructivist worldview, which would say, well, actually, within the sphere of European foreign policy, given that the emphasis is on forming policy on a unanimous point of view, then there's much more scope there for socialization between the 28 member states, of them coming together to try and come up with a common position. Of course, as Professor Matelau has already said, there is a backstory to the decision being taken, of course, through horse trading and so forth. But these are the two kind of theoretical frameworks to keep in mind when thinking about them. And this slide in pictorial form kind of buttresses what I've just said about, the power politics worldview, where some states are more equal than others and where power counts within the council. And then on the other side, we have much more of a coherence between the 28 member states in terms of thrusting forward European foreign policy. The next question, of course, that we have to really answer is that, well, who are these big three? Of course, no one really needs to be told that they each have a very strong historical heritage within the history of Europe, but there are also some factors which differentiate them as well. Of course, the two main ones from a foreign policy point of view is that France and the UK are, of course, permanent members of the UN Security Council, whereas Germany is not. And France and the UK, of course, are also nuclear powers, whereas Germany isn't as well. It's also important to bear in mind the domestic political structures that each of these countries have in place, and this has an impact upon how these governments or countries can form foreign policy. In France, it is in theory much easier for the French president to launch foreign policy action through an executive order than it is, for example, for the British Prime Minister to have to confer with his parliament, who may say yes or no to a particular action. And of course, in Germany, where there is a federal republic system, but where the emphasis is very much on coalition government and having to put together a policy between the political partners. Then, of course, there are some differential points in terms of how these countries view the world. Geographically, of course, each of these countries are located in different parts of Europe. Germany is in the center of Europe, in Mitteleuropa, and of course this impacts its policy. You can see the two words Westbindung and Ostpolitik, which were most prevalent during the Cold War, but still do have some relevance today. Westbindung, of course, being the German notion for having the West bound together in a political or a much more coherent political force, and Ostpolitik being the symbol of Germany's outreach to the East and to Russia in particular, and trying, in a sense, to try and balance between the two. In France, there is also the issue of balance as well, and it comes from de Gaulle's third way, as it's sometimes called, and this is essentially to play a rather ambivalent role between the West and the East as well. It's quite similar to Germany's position, although the third way, of course, within French thinking is very much related to notions of national independence, which is related to their independent nuclear deterrent, and also what's sometimes called anti-Americanism on the part of the French as well, but rather playing an ambivalence, and this was seen during the Cold War, of essentially being between the Soviet Union or Russia nowadays and the US on the other hand. And then the UK, which has traditionally based its foreign policy in the world on Churchill's notions of the three circles. The first circle, of course, being the transatlantic relationship, the second circle being European affairs, and thirdly, a Commonwealth relationship. So the Brits see themselves as very much a global power. Then, of course, belying these factors are also, importantly, the way these countries structure their economies. In France, there's much more of a dirigiste tradition, whereby there is some management of trying to maintain national strength through much more protectionist policies. In the UK, of course, following the tradition of Adam Smith and so forth, there's much more of an open market, free trade world view. And in Germany, we have the Wirtschaftswunder, which is a kind of combination of social protection and also open market, export-driven economy as well, which also has an impact upon the direction of foreign policy as well. Also, in terms of NATO and the military side of things, there are some important distinctions. Traditionally, the Germans and the British have been much more committed Atlanticists, much more committed to NATO than the French, although that balance can be seen to be changing slightly, maybe not in rhetorical terms, but in terms of what France is doing within NATO structures. Then, of course, we have the distinction between military activists and military non-activists as well. Germany, of course, for very understandable historical reasons, has an aversion to the blunt use of military force, whereas the French, as one can see in the Central African Republic presently, and in Libya, of course, with France and the UK, the Brits and the French tend to have a much more proactive military stance. So this is in a nutshell who these big three are. I will just skip through the slides to who indeed is leading the big three, because of course the first question is, if you assume that there is a driving factor within European foreign policy making in Europe, then you also have to ask the ancillary question, which is, well, who actually leads within the big three itself? And this is quite an important question, and some prevalent issues come to mind, and the characteristics of each of the member states come to mind as well. Essentially, what we have is a tension between the need to maintain national interests, so the national interests of each of these states, with European integration. And sometimes the two can work together, and in other instances, there is a certain clash over whether or not closer European integration actually reflects the national interests of these countries. As I've said before, there is in the military sphere or in defense policy the dichotomy between the more military-minded member states and the civilian power states, and what that means in terms of CSDP as well. Germany, within the big three itself, can be classed, I think, quite usefully as a kind of gentle giant. And that is the notion that although they're very powerful, especially in economic terms, they are, of course, the economic powerhouse of Europe, there is a German reluctance to take on leadership within Europe. And this is quite an important factor. It's a kind of slowly approach. Let the others perhaps slip up and make mistakes, and we can look at the long-term realistic picture of where Germany fits in. But the notion of never taking leadership, of course, has been borne out quite importantly recently with the financial crisis in the Eurozone. Then, of course, with the UK, there's this notion of the bridges, two bridges in particular between the United States and the UK, and the UK and Europe. And of course, for the Americans, Europe is very, very important. They have historically invested a lot in security in Europe, and they always saw the UK as a bridge to influence European policy as well. Well, the question mark is, does the recent exaggeration of EU scepticism within the current government in the UK mean that the bridge has collapsed between the UK and France, and what that means then in turn for the bridge between the UK and the US? Because, of course, if the Americans see that the Brits are no longer influential in Europe, especially if they leave, then there may be a situation where America will have to deal much more directly with some of the existing powers like France and Germany. And then, of course, we have France on top of this, and this is much more of a capabilities point of view and leadership point of view. I've termed it the puissance pathétique, which means that essentially historically France can be considered a great power. We see even to this day that it has the ability to launch military missions to far-flung parts of Africa. But on the other hand, they have serious economic questions. And of course, governments always have to have a balance between what they do in international affairs based on the health of their domestic state. There are, of course, big pros and cons to having some of these member states as well lead on European foreign policy. As I said with Germany, perhaps there isn't a case that people can look towards Germany to provide leadership within Europe. And of course, then the question comes, well, who do we look to actually for leadership on European foreign policy? Then, of course, there's the problem of the mismatch, as I've said, between national interests and European integration. Some of the foreign policy actions which member states would like to go forward with perhaps do not fit in with some of the interests of the other member states within the European Union as well. So there are pros and cons to having essentially Germany or the UK trying to lead within Europe. The next question that I'd like to address is really whether or not the big three works as well, because it's all very well having this concept, but what does it actually mean in terms of its policy? Now, I've not gone through all of the foreign policy issues which you've touched upon in your lectures, because of course there are many other issues of foreign policy related to trade, development and so forth, which are impacted on by the decisions of these three powers. But I think it's always helpful to look at the issue of military intervention and to see really where the interests of these three states come together and how indeed they impact upon European foreign policy. Well, of course, you can see in the instances where one of the states takes its own lead, and that being, of course, in 2003 with the Second Iraq War with the British joining the Americans, and France recently in Mali going their own national, predominantly national ways into a military intervention, has essentially led to EU disunity. We could not call any of these missions an EU mission, or indeed to have essentially a common European vision for any of these policy issues. Of course, Iraq is one of the best cases of the member states falling apart, breaking their different ways, and of course being quite insulting to each other in the process as well. Of course, in some instances as well, where you have partnership between two of the member states, and here I pick up on Libya in 2011, between the British and the French. Of course, you did have European action, but again, it led to disunity within Europe, because of course, Germany was abstained from military action in Libya. And of course, this led to the whole idea of there being some common approach from the European Union to fall by the wayside. Syria, of course, is rather outdated and is still ongoing, so it's unclear rather to see what the situation is. But one good example of where the three member states have come together and really addressed their own national interests in a particular policy field and have partnered together is in Somalia, of course, with the EU NAVFOR mission, which is the deployment of naval vessels to combat piracy off the Horn of Africa. Each of these member states agreed to take part in the military operation, to give it political support, to have a greater input into the political objectives of the mission as well. And you can see, therefore, today that we do have what's classed as an EU mission off the Horn of Africa, because these three member states have come together. So perhaps in this small example, one can see that there is a benefit to having the three big states at least forge together their own common objectives, if there is to be a basis for common European policy. the drivers, of course, of the big three, and this is just to try and wrap up now, of course, there is the idea that, of course, there is sovereign competition between these member states. They each have their own interests in the world and within Europe as well. There is a kind of quest for leadership, especially perhaps between the British and the French, but only for their own national interests to be forwarded rather than for there to be any advances in European integration. And then, of course, one must split them up, of course, because as Professor Matala said earlier on, countries can play different games. One day they can be friends, the French can be friends with the Germans, of course, and the other day they can be friends with the Brits on different policy areas. This in itself is not necessarily a bad thing, of course, depending on what policy issues you're talking about, because, of course, sometimes it's better to have two partners driving forward an issue than to have the uncomfortable situation of a third player putting all manner of roadblocks in the way. What breakers are there on the big three? Well, of course, as I said, there has been a traditional question mark over the position of the three member states towards NATO, which in itself can be quite difficult to put in place political agreement on what NATO should be doing in the world. There is, of course, understandably, a great deal of pragmatism between the member states in terms of their national interests, and this, of course, has the problem of not being or not allowing for many giant leaps forward within European foreign policy making as well. Then, of course, there is the issue of resources, because if one is talking about having a foreign policy, and especially in the deployment of military missions, but even more generally, one needs to be talking about what resources these member states have at their disposal. We've already seen that Germany, of course, has great economic resources at its behest. But of course, France and the UK also have traditionally great military resources as well. But there is, of course, a looming question mark over what happens to those military resources over the longer term. So that will also be an issue to bear in mind in terms of defense spending. Now, to really try and conclude here, and we should really ask the question, and this is quite an important question to ask, is whether they really do matter, these big three states within the European Union. From the European institutional side of things, we had, of course, the 2004 enlargement, which, of course, opened up the Council to many more votes and many more national interests. We also have the President of the EU Council, Herman Van Rompuy, who was put under Lisbon to try and bash the heads together of the member states, essentially, and to force compromise between them so that none of the individual national interests come to the surface too much. And then, of course, in the specific field of European foreign policy, we have the High Representative and the EAS, which, of course, served as a similar function within European foreign policy making as the Council President does. So Lady Ashton is supposed to try and force compromise between the member states. So that's an institutional argument, perhaps against the influence of the big three. Then, of course, there's the issue of variable geometry, because it's fair to say that if you have a policy problem in Latin America, you probably wouldn't pick the phone up to the British Prime Minister or to Chancellor Merkel. You'd probably go for states like Spain and Portugal, which have obviously a historical connection to these countries, and even linguistically, they have much more of a buy-in than many of the big three. So, of course, and even in the Eastern Mediterranean, there are countries which would be perhaps more important. One thinks of Greece, and also outside of the European Union, one thinks of Turkey. And then in Eastern Europe as well, where, of course, Germany has a very important role. But there are other countries as well, like Poland, which would have to be, of course, consulted in any foreign policy issue which points to that direction. And then there's the structure of world politics as well, which mustn't be overlooked. If we zoom out of the European Union, one would really ask whether or not, do countries like the UK and France really appear on the map seriously in places like Washington or Beijing? Germany, of course, because it's the economic powerhouse of Europe, may indeed on a regular basis appear on the radar screens of some of the world powers. And one would really need to ask, what the viewpoint would be in Washington looking at the European Union, whether or not they would approach it through the big three approach, or whether or not they'd look at the 28 members as a whole and try and divide and rule through that type of strategy as well. And then, of course, this also plays true for a lot of the BRICS as well. Russia, of course, plays a similar game. Brazil increasingly, but also China and India, would look at the EU not as a unified whole, but look at the 28 members to shop around to see what would be the best combination for their own interests. Where to? And here I will conclude. Of course, we always have the problem of national interests versus European integration. And this is really the single most important issue that we should take away from any analysis of the Big Three. How do you match together the individual national interests of these countries with the overall emphasis on European Union integration? What does it mean if any of the individual national interests come to the surface for European integration? What direction does it take overall? Whether or not there's control over the EU as well by any of these powers needs to be questioned, especially given now that the Union is 28 members large, and also we have, of course, the big stumbling block of there being unanimity within the Council as well, which of course forces the member states to some degree to try and self-abnegate their national interest to a certain extent, to try and maintain some form of compromise within the European Council. And I'd be happy to answer any questions anybody would have. I end there.
Let me thank everyone for logging in for this webinar on the European institutions and foreign policy. We have our next webinar coming up in March 2014, March the 26th to be precise. So do please mark that date already in your agendas. I presume some people might be plugging in from abroad. There's a big academic conference taking place in that time frame as well. So in any case, I will be seeing many of you already back in class in the meantime, and I guess that goes for several of us. So let me just wrap up here and wish everybody a very happy Christmas holidays.